There is a particular kind of silence that exists only inside hospitals at 3 in the morning. It is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of machines doing the work that human hands cannot. The low mechanical exhale of ventilators pushing air into lungs that have forgotten how to breathe on their own. The rhythmic green pulse of cardiac monitors charting the thin border between living and not. The soft shuffle of nurses moving between rooms with the practiced quiet of people who understand instinctively that sound itself costs something here. On the night of October 14th, that silence was shattered. Not by an explosion, not by a fire alarm or a code blue or the crash of a gurney. It was shattered by something far more insidious, far more terrifying in its totality. It was shattered by nothing, by absence. By the sudden and complete extinction of every screen, every monitor, every blinking cursor across 247 hospitals spanning 11 states, all going dark at precisely 3:07 in the morning, in a cascade so synchronized it could only have been engineered. In the ICU of Boston General, a ventilator connected to a 63-year-old man emitted one long, flat tone and stopped. In the pediatric ward of St. Catherine's in Providence, a nurse reached for a patient chart on her tablet and found only a black screen and 3 words in red. Your files are encrypted. In the cardiac unit of Mercy Regional in Hartford, an automated medication dispenser locked itself shut at the exact moment a patient needed her post-surgical drip adjusted, and the pharmacist who tried to override it found the system had no memory of her credentials, no memory of the patient, no memory of anything. 247 hospitals, gone. And somewhere in the city of Boston, in a third-floor apartment that smelled faintly of turmeric and rain, a woman named Priya Nair was already awake. She had been awake for hours. She had known this was coming. To understand what happened on October 14th, you have to go back 14 months. You have to go back to a woman sitting in a corner cubicle on the 7th floor of MedBridge Technologies' Boston headquarters, doing a job that almost no one fully understood, in a company that had recently decided that people who fully understood it were no longer the priority. MedBridge was, in the language of its own press releases, a healthcare technology infrastructure company. What it actually meant was this. MedBridge built and maintained the software architecture that connected hospital networks, the electronic health records, the pharmacy systems, the patient monitoring dashboards, the billing platforms, into a single, theoretically seamless ecosystem. Hundreds of hospitals across the northeastern United States ran on MedBridge's platform, which meant, in a way that the company's marketing department carefully avoided articulating, that hundreds of hospitals were only as secure as MedBridge's own defenses. Priya Nair had worked in MedBridge's cybersecurity division for 6 years. She had joined when the company was smaller, hungrier, more careful. She had stayed as it grew, as the venture capital arrived, as the executive suites began filling with people whose primary skill was the performance of confidence. She stayed because of the work itself, because there was something that genuinely mattered to her about protecting systems that protected people. And she stayed, if she was honest with herself on the long drives back to her mother's house in Waltham, because leaving felt like abandonment. Not of the company, of the patients on the other side of every firewall she maintained. She was 34 years old. She wore her hair pulled back in the same low bun every day, a habit so consistent her colleagues had stopped noticing it, which was, in its own way, a metaphor for everything. She spoke precisely and quietly. In meetings, she rarely volunteered opinions unless asked, and when she was asked, she gave answers that were thorough and technically dense, and regularly caused the more impatient executives to check their phones. She ate lunch at her desk. She did not attend company happy hours. She was, by every metric that MedBridge's newly redesigned culture valued, invisible. What was not invisible, what Priya had in fact been quietly, methodically building for the better part of a year, was a threat intelligence file that would have made the Department of Homeland Security uncomfortable. It had started with an anomaly, a small one. In late August of the previous year, Priya had noticed something odd in the network traffic logs. a pattern of probing queries originating from an IP cluster she didn't recognize, arriving in intervals too irregular to be automated, too consistent to be accidental. She flagged it internally. The automated ticketing system acknowledged receipt and assigned it a priority level of low. No human followed up. So she followed up herself. What she found over weeks of unpaid evening hours at her kitchen table while her mother slept fitfully in the next room was a sophisticated reconnaissance campaign. Someone was mapping Medbridge's network. Not clumsily, not loudly, but with the careful patience of a surgeon. They were learning the architecture, testing the edges, probing for weakness with the methodical intelligence of people who had done this before, who had done it well, and who were not in any hurry. She filed a formal threat assessment in October. It was received, reviewed briefly at a departmental meeting she was not invited to, and classified as speculative, insufficient evidence for escalation. Her manager at the time, a soft-spoken man named Greg who had recently been moved into his role from project management, told her privately that the new executive team was sensitive about security narratives that might unsettle the hospital clients currently in contract renewal. Maybe, he said with the helpless expression of a man who hated what he was saying, keep building the case. Just quietly. So she built it. Quietly. Obsessively. Month after month, she tracked the attackers. Because that was what they were, she was certain of it, as they probed and retreated and probed again. She learned their rhythms. She identified their preferred entry vectors. She found, buried in the legacy code of a third-party API integration that Medbridge had acquired 2 years earlier and never fully audited, what she believed was a pre-planted backdoor. A dormant piece of code, 23 lines long, that looked, if you glanced at it, like a routine authentication handler, and that was, if you read it with the particular kind of suspicious literacy that years of incident response builds in you, a trapdoor into the entire Medbridge ecosystem. She documented everything. She built a 58-page technical brief. She requested a meeting with the Chief Information Security Officer. The Chief Information Security Officer, a man named David Garrity, who had arrived 18 months ago from a fintech firm in New York, and who had very strong opinions about organizational agility and very limited patience for what he privately called doom loop thinking, agreed to give her 20 minutes. He gave her 11. Priya, he said at the 11-minute mark, I respect the work you've put into this, I do, but we have a third-party pen test scheduled for January. We have compliance locked in. We have a threat response vendor on retainer. I think what you're describing is a sophisticated interpretation of some ambiguous data, and I think the more productive use of your time is focusing on the fourth quarter patch cycle. He paused. Does that make sense? It made no sense. But she nodded because she had learned over 6 years when a room was closed. She went back to her cubicle and kept working. The company-wide meeting was called for October 13th at 2 in the afternoon. The conference room on the 9th floor had been arranged with the particular theatrical care that signals to anyone who has worked in enough corporations that something is being performed. There were catered sandwiches. There were slides with gradients. There was a lapel microphone. The star of the meeting, as everyone understood before it began, was Marcus Webb. Marcus had joined Medbridge 8 months ago as Executive Vice President of Product Strategy. He was 41, tall, charming in the way of people who have been told they are charming for so long they have stopped thinking about it. He had a gift for making complex things sound simple, and simple things sound visionary. He wore open-collar shirts to meetings where everyone else wore ties, which is a specific power move that only works if you are already winning, and Marcus was always already winning. The meeting was mostly about growth, new hospital contracts, an acquisition in development, a partnership with a major insurance carrier. Marcus presented all of it with the easy fluency of a man who believed, genuinely and without arrogance, that he was steering something important. Then he opened the floor. He called on Priya because she had her hand raised. In 6 years, Priya had never raised her hand in an all-hands meeting. Something in her, some exhausted, frightened, obstinate corner of her, had decided that today was the day she would try one more time. Priya, right? Cybersecurity? Marcus said, pointing at her with the casual precision of someone who has practiced remembering names as a professional skill. Yes, she said. She stood up. Her voice was steady. I want to flag something I think needs urgent attention. Over the past 14 months, I have been tracking what I believe is a coordinated reconnaissance campaign targeting our network infrastructure. I have identified what appears to be a pre-planted backdoor in the Veridian API integration. I have documented everything in a formal brief. I think we need to convene a security review before we bring any new hospital systems online. The room was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of consideration, the quiet of calculation. Marcus smiled. It was a particular kind of smile, not cruel, not dismissive, something more dangerous than either, patient. Amused, the way a professor might be amused by a student who has confused passion for evidence. Priya, he said, first, I love the commitment. Seriously, that kind of vigilance is exactly what we want to see. He paused, and the pause did the work. I've been briefed on your assessment. I've talked to David about it, and here's what I'd say. We have multiple layers of security review in place. We have a team. We have vendors. I think when we are in a room like this, focused on growth and partnership and what we are building together, it is important that we are not, how do I put this, letting perfect be the enemy of good. Another pause. He turned to the room, a slight opening of his hands. We are not going to ground the plane every time someone thinks they see a bird, he said. And the room laughed. Not cruelly, which would have been, in a way, more honest. The room laughed with the reflexive, relieved laughter of people who have been let off the hook, who are grateful that the person at the front has decided this is a joke and not a problem. Because problems require things of them and jokes do not. Priya sat down. She looked at her hands in her lap. She did not look up. She did not look around the room to count how many people were still smiling. She waited for the meeting to resume, and when it did, she stood up from her chair, walked to the elevator, rode it to the ground floor, walked outside into the gray October air, and called her mother. Her mother, Kamala, did not answer. She was at her chemotherapy appointment. Priya had taken the morning off to drive her there, had stayed until the infusion started, had left at noon to be back in time for the meeting. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed. She went back upstairs. She sat at her cubicle. She opened her laptop, pulled up the threat intelligence file she had been building for 14 months, and she stared at it for a long time. And then she did something she had never let herself fully do before. She opened a new document and began writing out what she knew, not in the careful, deferential language of an internal brief, not hedged for office politics or executive sensibility, but fully, precisely, technically. What she knew about the back door, how it worked, what it was waiting for, and what would happen when someone finally told it to wake up. She did not know, as she wrote, that she had fewer than 13 hours. She left the office at 6:15. Her mother was home by then, tired in the specific bone-deep way of someone whose body is fighting a war it did not choose. Kamala Nair was 61 and had been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer 7 months ago, which had restructured Priya's entire existence in ways she had not had time to fully process because she had been too busy managing them. She had reorganized her schedule around treatment appointments. She had rearranged the apartment so her mother could move through it more easily. She had taken over the cooking, which her mother watched from the kitchen doorway and occasionally improved with unsolicited commentary about cumin. Tonight, Priya made dal. She made it the way her mother had taught her, slowly, attentively, with the right amount of patience for each stage. They ate at the small table by the window with the news on low in the background, and her mother asked about her day in the careful way of someone who can tell something is wrong and is deciding whether to push. "Long meeting," Priya said. Kamala looked at her daughter for a moment. She had her daughter's same dark eyes, but none of her daughter's restraint. "Did you eat the sandwiches they put out?" "No." Priya: "I wasn't hungry. You're never hungry when something's wrong." Priya put down her spoon. She looked at her mother and thought about saying the whole of it. The meeting, the laugh, Marcus Webb's face, the weight of 14 months of careful work being dismissed in a sentence about birds and planes. But her mother had taken enough weight today. The infusion chair, the cold saline through the port in her chest, the stack of medical paperwork on the counter that neither of them had opened yet. "I'm fine," Priya said. "Eat." She washed the dishes after. Her mother went to bed at 9. Priya sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, reading through her threat file one more time, not looking for anything new, just existing with it. The way you sometimes need to sit with the thing that is frightening you, just to remind yourself that you understand it. At 11:47 in the evening, her phone rang. It was Greg, her manager. He sounded like a man who had been asleep and had woken to something that had reorganized his understanding of the night. "Priya." His voice was thin. "Something's happening." She was already sitting up straighter. "What kind of something?" "The network monitoring system just flagged a cascade event. We're seeing simultaneous outages across multiple hospital client systems. Boston General, St. Catherine's in Providence, Mercy Regional in Hartford. There are more coming in. The operations center is trying to assess, but..." She heard him swallow. "The screens are dark, Priya. The hospital screens are dark." She was already opening her secure remote access terminal. "How many hospitals?" she said. A pause. She could hear voices in the background, the particular sound of people who are frightened trying to sound technical. "Right now? 40? Maybe 50? But it's still..." His voice broke for just a moment, then collected itself. "It's still spreading." She was already typing. Her hands were completely steady. "Greg," she said, "I need you to get me access to the Veridian integration layer logs from the past 6 hours. Full stack. Don't let anyone touch them. Don't let anyone restart anything. Whatever's running, let it run. Because if we interrupt it, we lose the trace. Priya, David wants to bring in the incident response vendor. The vendor won't know what they're looking at," she said. "Not unkindly, just factually." "I do. Give me the access." A long pause. "Okay," Greg said. She worked through midnight. She worked through 1 in the morning. She worked through 2. At some point, her mother appeared in the doorway of the kitchen in her robe, squinting at the light from the laptop screen, and Priya said, without looking up, "Go back to sleep. Everything is fine." Which was a lie so significant it had its own particular texture, but her mother went back to bed, and Priya kept working. What she found confirmed every word of every report she had written, and every concern she had flagged, and every meeting she had been talked over in or laughed out of or patiently redirected from. The back door had activated. The 23 lines of dormant code in the Veridian API integration had received a command, encrypted, routed through 3 different proxy chains, formatted to look like routine maintenance traffic, and had opened a channel, and through that channel, ransomware had traveled at the speed of fiber optic, replicating through the MedBridge ecosystem with the awful efficiency of something that had been designed specifically for this network by people who had spent more than a year learning its every corridor and ventilation shaft. It was not random. It was not opportunistic. It was targeted, precise, and catastrophic. By 3 in the morning, the number of affected hospitals was 247. 247 hospitals in 11 states. Ventilators defaulting to manual. Medication dispensers locked. Electronic health records inaccessible. Surgical scheduling systems blank. Pharmacy systems offline. blood bank inventories invisible. In at least 9 hospitals, backup generators had kicked in, but the ransomware had already reached the secondary systems those generators were protecting. In 2 hospitals, the emergency reversion to paper-based protocols had revealed that the paper backup procedures had not been updated in 4 years and referenced departments that no longer existed in the same configuration. At Boston General, the 63-year-old man in the ICU was being manually ventilated by a respiratory therapist named Colleen, who was trying to maintain consistent pressure with her hands while simultaneously communicating with the attending physician in the dark, because the overhead lighting system was on the same circuit as the automated environmental controls. And when the hospital's building management software went offline, 3 floors of non-emergency lighting had gone with it. Colleen would manually ventilate that patient for 4 hours and 22 minutes. She would never fully recover from that night. At 3:22 in the morning, Priya's phone rang again. This time it wasn't Greg. It was Marcus Webb. He had a different voice at 3:22 in the morning than he had had at 2 in the afternoon. The lapel microphone voice was gone. What was left was something raw and small and genuinely afraid. "Priya," he said, "I need your help." She held the phone for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, Boston was its usual nighttime self, orange-lit, indifferent, continuous. She thought about the laugh in the conference room. She thought about the 11-minute meeting with David Garrity. She thought about 58 pages of careful, documented, evidenced work sitting in a folder labeled speculative. Insufficient evidence for escalation. She thought about 247 hospitals, about what was happening in them right now, in the dark. "I know," she said. "I know you flagged this. I know we didn't." He stopped. Started again. "We need you. David's here. The vendor is here. They don't understand what they're looking at. Greg told us you already have the logs. He said you knew about the back door." A pause. "Is that true?" "Yes," she said. "Can you fix it?" And here was the question that would define the rest of the night. Not the technical question. She already knew in broad strokes what fixing it required, what the architecture of the solution was, what the sequence of steps would need to be. The technical question was hard but answerable. She had spent 14 months preparing for it without ever letting herself believe she would have to. The question that hung in the air of her kitchen at 3:22 in the morning was a different one. Older, more human. She thought about something her mother had said to her once, years ago, when Priya had come home from school, upset about something a teacher had done. Something unfair, something small in retrospect, but enormous at 12 years old. Kamala had listened, and then she had said, in the matter-of-fact way, she delivered all her deepest truths. "The way other people treat you is about them, Priya. What you do next is about you." She thought about the man in the ICU at Boston General, who was lying in a hospital bed somewhere in this city with a machine breathing for him, or right now with a human being breathing for him with their hands. She thought about the pediatric ward. "Yes," Priya said, "I can fix it. I'm going to need full administrative access to the Veridian integration environment. I'm going to need your vendor off the active incident response channel because I cannot work around people who don't know what they're doing, and I'm going to need someone on site at Boston General who can execute physical network commands on my direction." A silence. She could hear Marcus processing the shift in who, in this particular conversation, held the weight. "Okay," he said, "whatever you need." "And Marcus," she said. Not coldly, not triumphantly. Just clearly, with the specific clarity of someone who has decided that the moment calls for truth and has nothing left to lose by offering it. "When this is over, I need you to understand that everything you're dealing with right now was preventable, not in hindsight. 14 months ago." Another silence. "I know," he said, And she believed him. She hung up and put on a second pot of coffee. What followed was not cinematic in the way that word usually means. There were no explosions. There was no running. There was a woman sitting at a kitchen table in a Waltham apartment wearing the same clothes she had worn to work that morning, her hair escaping the low bun in slow increments, typing with a focus so absolute it was almost meditative, drinking coffee she barely tasted, talking on a headset to a rotating cast of panicking people and keeping her voice level through all of it. She began with the back door itself, isolating it, studying it, understanding the precise command structure it had used to activate. The ransomware was sophisticated but not unprecedented. It was a variant of a known strain, modified and customized for this specific environment by people who had done their homework. The encryption it had deployed was strong, but Priya had spent months studying this attacker's methodology, and she had a hypothesis about their key management. A pattern she had noticed in their earlier reconnaissance probes suggesting they used a specific non-standard key derivation function that, if her analysis was correct, created a predictable vulnerability. If her analysis was correct. She had never tested it on a live system. She had tested it in a sandboxed environment she had built in her own time, on her own equipment, using a simulated version of the Veridian integration environment she had reconstructed from memory and documentation. She had tested it 17 times. It had worked 15 of those 17 times. This was not a comfortable statistic when 247 hospitals were offline. At 4:10 in the morning, she got a call from the on-site network technician at Boston General, a young man named Kevin Cho, who had been roused from home and was now standing in a server room that was running on emergency lighting, doing exactly what she told him to do, and occasionally making small, frightened sounds he was trying to suppress. "Kevin," she said, "I need you to physically trace the Veridian integration server and find the secondary network interface card. It should be in slot 3 of the chassis. Can you do that? Yeah, I think so. Give me a minute." She waited. She heard the sound of movement, of flashlight beams. "Got it," he said. "Good. I need you to manually disable it. There should be a small toggle switch on the card itself. It's a legacy physical override that was grandfathered in from the pre-2019 hardware generation. Pull it down." A pause. She could hear him moving. "Pulled," he said. "Okay. Now I need you to do something counterintuitive. I need you to not restart anything. I need you to wait for my signal before you touch anything else." "How long?" She looked at her screen. She was in the process of constructing a targeted decryption sequence, essentially working backwards through the ransomware's encryption using her hypothesis about the key derivation function to derive the master decryption key. It was delicate work, the digital equivalent of picking a lock while wearing oven mitts. 20 minutes, she said. Maybe 30. Kevin said nothing. She could hear him breathing. At 4:31 in the morning, her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway again. This time, she did not go back to bed. She went to the counter, filled the electric kettle, plugged it in. She moved quietly, the way she always moved in the small hours of the morning, with the unhurried self-possession of a woman who has learned not to disturb whatever delicate, necessary thing her daughter is doing. She made 2 cups of tea. She set one beside Priya's laptop without a word. Priya looked at it. She looked at her mother, who had already retreated to the doorway, watching her with an expression that had no name in English. Something that was love and pride and worry and patience, all occupying the same space simultaneously. "Go to bed," Priya said quietly, covering the microphone on her headset. "I'm fine," her mother said, which was its own lie, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Kamala sat down at the far end of the table with her tea and said nothing else. At 4:58 in the morning, Priya finished constructing the decryption sequence. She looked at it for a long time. Her hypothesis was right, or it wasn't. There was a version of the next few minutes in which she deployed this sequence, and it worked. and the hospitals began to come back online in a cascade as orderly as the cascade that had taken them down. And there was a version in which it failed, in which the key derivation was slightly different from what she had theorized, and the sequence made things worse. She had been wrong twice in 17 tests. She picked up the phone. Greg was still on the line. "Greg," she said, "I need you to clear the entire incident response channel. Everyone off. I need 30 seconds of complete quiet." She heard shuffling, voices receding. "Clear," Greg said. She looked at the sequence on her screen. She thought about the man at Boston General. She didn't know his name. She was thinking of an idea, the idea of a man, the idea of someone's father or husband or son, lying in a hospital bed with a stranger's hands breathing for him in the dark, waiting. She deployed the sequence. The next 17 seconds were the longest of her life. And then, incrementally, unevenly, in the imperfect and beautiful way that broken things begin to reconstitute themselves, the screen started coming back. It did not happen all at once. That is important to understand. The restoration of 247 hospital networks was not a dramatic single switch flip, not a Hollywood moment of every light coming on simultaneously in a great surge of triumph. It was slow. It was uncertain at first. It happened in stages that required different interventions at different hospitals, because even with the master decryption sequence deployed, each system had to be walked through a manual validation process, and some backup systems had to be coaxed back online separately, and in 3 hospitals there were secondary complications that required additional triage. But it happened. At 5:14 in the morning, the first hospital systems in Boston came back online. At 5:19, a cluster of 12 hospitals in Connecticut. At 5:47, the hospital in Providence, where a nurse had been staring at a locked screen for more than 2 hours. At 6:02, the last of the 247. Kevin Cho, the technician at Boston General, called Priya at 5:17 to tell her the ICU monitors were back. His voice was doing something it was clearly not accustomed to doing in professional settings. "The ventilators reinitialized correctly," he said. "The respiratory tech in ICU..." He stopped. "She's been manually ventilating a patient for almost 3 hours. She put the bag down. "She's sitting on the floor in the hallway." Priya closed her eyes. "Is the patient okay?" she said. "Yeah," Kevin said. "Yeah, they think so. Priya..." He stopped again. "Thank you." She sat for a moment with the phone against her cheek, eyes still closed, listening to the particular quality of the silence that had come back into the apartment now that the most acute pressure had passed. A silence with texture and weight, the silence of aftermath. Then she took the headset off and sat back in her chair. Her tea had gone cold. The kitchen window was beginning to show the very first color of dawn. Not light exactly, but the suggestion of it. The deep blue loosening at the edges towards something the color of a bruise healing. Her mother was still at the other end of the table. Kamala Nair looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she said simply, "Eat something." Priya laughed. It was a short, involuntary, exhausted laugh. The kind that does not mean things are funny, but that the body sometimes needs to issue when it has been holding too much for too long. She put her face in her hands and laughed, and then she pressed her eyes, and when she lifted her face again, she was not laughing anymore. "I'm okay," she said. "I know you're okay," her mother said. "I didn't say you weren't okay. I said eat something." The official incident investigation began the same morning. The Department of Health and Human Services, the FBI's Cyber Division, and 2 separate state attorneys general were all involved within 72 hours. The threat actor responsible for the attack, a ransomware group operating out of Eastern Europe with documented ties to 3 prior attacks on critical infrastructure, was identified within 2 weeks. Their operational capacity was significantly degraded by the attribution and the subsequent law enforcement coordination that followed. MedBridge Technologies faced regulatory scrutiny of a severity that reconfigured the company's priorities overnight. The Veridian API integration was taken offline and fully audited. A dozen systemic security failures were documented. David Garrity left the company 6 weeks after the incident by mutual agreement, which is what corporations say when a person is held responsible for something in a way that cannot be stated plainly. Marcus Webb did not leave. He had a conversation with the CEO that lasted 2.5 hours. What came out of it was a restructuring of the company's security posture, an emergency budget allocation of $40 million for infrastructure hardening, and an offer made to Priya Nair the following week. She was in her cubicle when Marcus appeared at the edge of it. He did not make the gesture of knocking because there was no door to knock on, but he did the cubicle equivalent, pausing at the threshold and waiting for acknowledgement. She looked up. He did not look the way he had looked in the conference room 2 weeks earlier. He looked like a man who had spent 2 weeks doing a specific kind of internal accounting. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had found something in himself he hadn't known was there and was not entirely sure yet what to do with it. "Can I come in?" he said. She gestured at the chair beside her desk. He sat down. He did not open with preamble or strategy. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said on the phone. That night. About 14 months. She waited. "I looked at your reports," he said. "The full archive. All of them. I read every one." A pause. "I wanted to understand how this happened. How we ended up here. And what I found when I read your work was that—" He stopped. He was choosing his words with a care she had not seen from him before. The failure wasn't technical. The failure was that we created a culture where the right information couldn't reach the people who needed to hear it, where someone who knew something important didn't have a path to being heard. "No," Priya said, "I had a path. I had multiple paths. I used all of them. He absorbed that." "You're right," he said. "The failure was that we heard you and chose not to listen. The distinction mattered." She could see that he understood it did. He offered her the position of Chief Information Security Officer, not the existing role with its existing culture, but a rebuilt role with direct board access, budget authority, and a mandate to rebuild the security function from the ground up. He told her she could build her own team. She looked at him for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He started to stand, then paused. "Priya," he stopped, started again. "I'm sorry. For the meeting, for the laugh. That was wrong. What I said was wrong. I was more interested in performing certainty than engaging with something uncertain, and it cost people." He paused. "I'm sorry. It was not a performance." She would think about this later, would turn it over several times, and each time she would arrive at the same conclusion. It was not a performance. It was simply a man who had been required by events to look at something true about himself, and who had looked. "I know," she said. 2 months after the attack, on a Wednesday morning in December, Priya Nair drove her mother to a chemotherapy appointment at Massachusetts General Hospital. This was routine now, the particular routine of love that organizes itself around illness, that has learned the fastest route, the least stressful parking structure, the nurse whose name is Elena and who always gets the port access right on the first try. They moved through these routines with the ease of long practice, and Priya sat beside her mother during the infusion the way she always sat, close enough that her mother could reach her, working on her laptop but not really working, mostly just being present in the particular way that someone is present when they understand that presence is itself a kind of doing. At some point, Kamala said, without opening her eyes, "The hospitals are all back?" "All of them," Priya said, "have been for weeks. And the people? The patients that night?" Priya hesitated. The honest answer was complicated. There had been adverse events, medications delayed, procedures postponed, a handful of situations where the 4-hour darkness had created complications whose consequences would trail into months. There had been one death that the investigators believed, though could not conclusively prove, was connected to the outage. She held that knowledge with the specific weight it deserved. Most of them, she said, almost all. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "You saved them," Kamala said. "I solved a technical problem," Priya said. Her mother opened her eyes. She looked at her daughter with the unflinching specificity that only mothers can sustain. "Those are the same thing," she said. "For the person on the other side of it, those are exactly the same thing." Priya looked at her laptop screen without seeing it. Outside the window of the infusion suite, Boston was gray and cold and continuous, carrying on with the enormous indifference of a city that does not know, cannot know, what has been held together inside its borders by quiet hands. She thought about a nurse sitting on a hallway floor, a bag on the linoleum beside her, putting her hands in her lap after 3 hours. She thought about a ventilator resuming its soft, mechanical exhale. She thought about 23 lines of code sitting dormant in a legacy system for 14 months, waiting, and the woman who had found them, and what it had taken to stay. She thought about all the invisible work, all the work that happens in the dark, that is never rewarded, never observed, never applauded, that is sometimes actively suppressed by the people with the loudest voices and the most confident smiles and the power to make a room laugh at the wrong moment. The work that is done anyway because the alternative is walking away from something that matters, and some people, not many, but some, find that they cannot do that it is not in them to do that. She thought about her mother's hands on a cup of tea, set beside a laptop at 5 in the morning without a word. She thought about what respect actually is. Not the performance of it in a conference room, not the certificate or the title or the salary, but the real version, the earned version, which is simply being seen, being actually fully, finally seen. She reached over and took her mother's hand. Kamala squeezed it once. Didn't say anything. The infusion dripped on. The city continued. And in 247 hospitals across 11 states, screens glowed steady and bright in the ordinary morning, and the machines did their quiet, necessary work, and no one who was supposed to be breathing stopped. There is a lesson buried in the quiet parts of this story, if you are willing to look for it. Not the lesson about cybersecurity, though that lesson is real and urgent and billions of dollars of infrastructure remain as vulnerable today as Medbridge's was on the night of October 13th. The deeper lesson is about what we do with the people who see things others cannot. The people who work in corners and eat at their desks and send emails that get marked low priority and sit in the back of rooms where the decisions get made without them. The people who know what is coming and who keep knowing it, patiently, without the comfort of being believed, because knowledge does not stop being true when it is ignored. We spend a great deal of our organizational and cultural energy rewarding the performance of confidence. We promote the people who speak first, who speak loudest, who have the gift of making complicated things feel simple and simple things feel visionary. We build systems, consciously and unconsciously, that filter for this quality. But the crises, the real ones, the ones that extinguish hospital monitors at 3 in the morning and put nurses on the floor of hallways, the real crises are rarely solved by performance. They are solved by the person who has been quietly doing the work. They are solved by Priya Nair, sitting at a kitchen table in the dark, with cold tea and her mother watching, and her hands completely steady. The question this story leaves us with is not whether Priya should be respected. The question is why we made her earn it. She never wanted to be the hero. She just refused to stop being right.